On his visit to Boston in 2012, Michael D. Higgins, the President of Ireland, said, "The Irish famine of 1845 to 1850 was the greatest social calamity in terms of mortality and suffering that Ireland has ever experienced. From late summer 1845, a hitherto unknown fungus, to which there was then no known antidote, attacked and partially destroyed the potato crop in Ireland. During the crisis years, it is estimated that over 1 million Irish people perished from hunger, or more commonly from hunger-related diseases. In the decade following 1846, more than 1.8 million Irish emigrated." Early waves of Irish famine immigrants often crossed the Irish Sea to leave from the British port of Liverpool. Others would leave from Dublin, Belfast, Limerick, Sligo, Galway, and Queenstown, which is today known as Cove, just south of Cork. Many refugees walked long distances to get to a port. This artist's rendering shows Irish crowded onto a ship about to depart from Queenstown. Passage money came from charitable institutions, philanthropists, government subsidies, and other sources. The voyage would take several weeks, and food and water were limited. Diseases such as typhus spread easily in the crowded conditions on board, where steerage passengers shared space with cargo. Canada and the eastern United States were common destinations for those fleeing the Irish famine. Arrival ports included Quebec, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and New Orleans. In 1847 alone, 370,000 Irish refugees landed in Boston. The sick would first stay in a quarantine hospital on Deer Island in Boston Harbour. More than 800 died and were buried there on the island. The many Irish emigrants who survived often first lived in North End, long before it became home to the Italian immigrants. Hingham was one of the many Boston area destinations where these immigrants would start their new lives.
Many Irish immigrants arrived in Hingham between the 1850s and 1870s. Irish continued to arrive here into the early 20th century. The largest number of those who settled in Hingham were from County Cork, but Tipperary and other Irish counties also were represented among the families who made Hingham their new home. Those who settled here had little formal education and chose Hingham for work opportunities, often in the town's factories. The immigrant Irish community in Hingham in the late 19th and early 20th century was concentrated in West Hingham. The Irish also settled in smaller residential clusters in other parts of Hingham. In this programme, you will learn more about the Irish immigrants and their families who made their homes in the late 19th century in West Hingham on Elm Street, Emerald Street, Hersey Street and Crows Lane. You also will hear about Irish immigrants on nearby Thaxter Street and Green Street. Many of the homes they built still stand. Elm Street, initially a dirt, unpaved road, was created by the town in 1847, not long before the Irish began to settle in Hingham. The road, which runs from Hershey Street to Main Street, ending just across from the old ship meeting house, was built to provide a faster and less steep connection to the downtown area near Hingham Harbour. Wagons full of farm goods or woodenware headed for the freight depot or the harbour wharfs had a hard time on the steep incline that Hersey Street makes to arrive downtown at South Street.
We'll begin our tour in Elm Street at the corner of what is now Lafayette Street. Around 1885, Daniel Hickey, a blacksmith, moved from an earlier home he and his wife had on Ship Street to the corner of Lafayette and Elm Streets. Daniel had a horseshoeing barn here where he conducted business. Daniel was a son of Irish immigrants John Hickey and Bridget Hackett Hickey, who arrived in Hingham around 1835, earlier than many Irish, and raised their family on North Street, near Mill Street. Daniel's dad, John, worked at the Howard Iron Foundry, known for producing the Howard plough blade, as an iron melter, also known as a furnace man or moulder. Daniel's older brother, James, who became a moulder also, like his dad, and took his trade into the Civil War, likely held great cannonballs for the army on the north. Brother Thomas, a blacksmith, would serve in a cavalry unit where his skills also would have been in demand. Both brothers survived the war. An older sister of Daniel Hickey, Ellen, like many young Irish women in the Hingham neighbourhood, at age 16 worked at the Burr Brown Tassel factory. We'll hear more about that factory a little later. As Irish immigrants arrived, Hingham's industry was growing, due in part to a new opportunity to ship goods by train from the downtown Hingham freight depot. The South Shore train line had started running through Hingham in 1849. From their homes in Elm Street, Irish immigrant men and women could walk to work at the woolen factory, later a leatherette factory, located between 70 and 74 Elm Street, and in operation from 1872 into the early 20th century. Also employing many men in the neighbourhood was a rope walk on Hersey Street, run by Irish immigrant James Dower, who'd come from Waterford in about 1850. James began his specialty rope product operation after first working at Hingham's cordage factory and rope walk, which operated from 1852 to 1902. Initially accessible by a dirt road from Main Street, that factory burnt down in 1865. The factory was quickly rebuilt and was busy enough by 1872 that a new road, Central Street, was created, first running only between Main and Elm Street. The interruption of work created by the fire may be what inspired James Dower to start his own rope walk adjacent to his home on Hersey Street. Dower's specialty products included pre-stretched hangman's rope as well as life-saving lines used by rescue stations along the coastline. The rope-making mechanism from the Dower rope walk, shown here, is on display at Hingham Town Hall on loan from the Hingham Historical Society.
If you walked along Elm Street in 1880, you likely would have encountered Thomas Morrissey, then 45, who made his living as an unskilled labourer. Thomas and his Irish immigrant wife, Mary Carroll, had arrived in 1848 and soon married at the Catholic Church in Randolph, at the time where there was no Catholic Church in Hingham. By 1880, the Morrisseys have 7 children, including 2 sets of twins. 2 of their sons, John, then 24, and Thomas, then 19, at the time of the 1880 census, had both found work at a shoe factory. Thomas and his family lived on 56 Elm Street. Emerald Street was created by the town of Hingham after Irish immigrant John Pine, in 1861, petitioned the town to create a formal roadway to replace the rough dirt path to his home, which he'd built in the woods off of Elm Street. By the time of the 1880 census, Emerald Street was almost entirely occupied by Irish immigrant families. Families included Burns, Donahue, Moore, O'Keefe, O'Reilly and Pine. John Pine, a labourer, was born in County Cork in 1828 and arrived in the US in 1850. John married Mary McCarthy, who had arrived with her parents in 1850 and first lived on Thaxter Street. Mary and John married in 1860 at a Catholic church in Randolph, and their home soon had an address on what would be soon known as Emerald Street. One of their sons, John Walter Pine, born in Hingham in 1866, as an adult became an undertaker. The funeral home by John Walter Pine, since sold by the family, it is known today as the Pine Keown Funeral Home. Since its founding in the late 19th century, the business is operated from the expanded version of what was originally the Pine family home on 21 Emerald Street.
If you had visited Emerald Street in 1895, you might have seen Irish immigrant Michael Burns at work in a quarry he had just opened at a business behind his home. Michael and his extended family lived for decades at number 7 and number 17 Emerald Street. The deep lot behind these homes still features an area of rocky ledge where Michael had his quarry operation. In 1972, three of the Michael's daughters, Margarita, Caroline, and Anna, sold this land to Hingham for conservation. Known today as Burns Memorial Park, the conservation area can be accessed through Hersey Street. As you leave Emerald Street and turn left back onto Elm Street, you will pass the former home of Michael Burns' older brother, John Burns. John, after emigrating with his brother and two sisters from County Cork in the 1850s, worked as a labourer. In 1860, John had married Mary Quinn, who had emigrated in the 1850s from County Cork with her parents, who had settled on Thaxter Street. Among John and Mary's 6 children listed in the 1880 census were 3 teenagers, Mary 19, Davis 17, and Nellie 15, who worked at the woolen factory, just steps from the home at 62 Elm Street. John and Michael Burns' 2 sisters, Mary and Hannah, married 2 brothers from Tipperary, Patrick and John Moore. Mary's husband, Patrick Moore, died at 63, and in 1880, Mary was living with her 6 children on Emerald Street. 3 teenage sons helped support the family. 2 worked at the rope walk and 1 at a paint shop. Hannah Burns and her husband, John J. Moore, made their home on Elm Street. Of their 9 children, only 5 could live past childhood. Loss of a spouse, infant mortality, and childhood deaths due to heart disease, scarlet fever, pneumonia, and tuberculosis were common in the late 19th century, decades before we understood how to prevent heart disease or had antibiotics or vaccines.
The Irish community gathered often to mourn the loss of loved ones at St. Paul's Church, whose cornerstone was laid in June 12, 1870, with the dedication to follow in 1871. The growing Catholic community of Hingham had acquired the land on North Street at Bering Road and raised the money for their own Catholic church. To design the church, they hired a prominent church architect, Patrick Charles Keeley, who was himself an Irish immigrant. St. Paul's Cemetery on Hersey Street began with a parcel off Hersey Street in 1877. The first burial there was for Joseph Michael Lemner, a 9-month-old grandson of Irish immigrant Michael Fee, you will hear more about later in this programme. The cemetery would later expand in 1898 on land acquired after John Dower's rope walk closed following his death. The entrance pillars to the expanded cemetery were built by Irish immigrant stonemason John Moriarty, who lived on Elm Street with his wife Mary Thompson and her brother. Mary would be one of the many young adults in the community who would die after contracting tuberculosis.
Before we resume our visits to the streets of Hingham's Irish village, let's stop at Hingham Cemetery, down near the harbour. Here there's a monument honouring those from Hingham who fought and died in the Civil War. It includes the names of 5 members of the Irish community. Among them is Michael Fee, an Irish immigrant whose infant grandchild was the first to be buried over at St. Paul's Cemetery. Michael had volunteered to fight for his new country. After being wounded and captured, he was released in a prisoner exchange but died of his wounds in Washington, D.C. hospital in 1863. Another young soldier from the Irish community who died after being a prisoner of war in conflict was Corporal William Breen, son of Irish immigrants from John Breen and Susan Joyce, who died at age 22 in 1864. The 3 other soldiers at Hingham's Irish community honoured on this monument are Richard James Farrell, James Fitzgerald, and Daniel Murphy. As the 19th century was drawing to a close, the next generation in the Irish immigrant community started to find new work opportunities. One son of John J. Moore and Hannah Burns, named John J. Moore, Jr., at just 14 years of age, started work laying pipe for what was then called the Waterworks, bringing fresh water through town, initially from Acord Pond, before wells were drilled to create additional supply. 84 Elm Street is the home that John Moore Jr. built for his family. John had by then married Mary Maguire of Kingston, whose parents, like John's, were Irish immigrants. John and Mary sadly lost two young daughters to diphtheria in 1880, before there was a vaccine. John became a builder and developer, and he found some investment opportunities in the neighbourhood. Maple Street, which is now an L-shaped street off Elm, was added to the community through the work of John J. Moore Jr. In 1895, when he was just 29 years old, John bought a large tract of land on Elm Street, just across from Emerald Street, owned by the heirs of Rufus Lane, and announced his plans to subdivide the property by home lots. By 1904, Maple Street was on the Hingham street map. The next street we'll explore is Hershey Street, where we will learn about more of Hingham's Irish immigrant families. If you take a right from Elm onto Hershey Street, you will soon come to number 66 Hershey Street, a home built in the 1870s. Here, immigrants Patrick Coughlin and his wife Mary Daly began raising their family of 6 sons and 3 daughters. Patrick, a labourer, died in 1876 at aged 43. His wife Mary was then supported by her children, including Bartholomew, who at age 18 worked at the Burr, Brown and Tassel factory. This factory, where many of the sons and daughters of Irish immigrants worked, was located on Fearing Road, immediately behind St. Paul's Church, where the St. Paul's Parish Grade School is today. The Coughlin home on Hershey Street stayed in the Coughlin family until 1967. The Burr, Brown Tassel factory supplied decorative items desirable during what is known as the Gilded Age. Items such as trim for carriages as well as for shades, curtains and upholstery. The factory was closed in 1898 but then sold to the Boston Spiral Tagging Company, whose operation became known in Hingham as the Shoestring Factory. The factory was taken down in the 1930s, and the land was later sold for what in 1952 became as St. Paul's Elementary School. Just across Hershey Street from the Coughlin home was number 51 Hershey Street, home of John Henry Fee and his wife Joanne Haley. The Fee family had been leaders in the Irish community here for decades. John's father Thomas, his wife Mary Baxter, and Thomas's brother Michael emigrated from Galway in 1849. Thomas built a home for the family in 31 Cedar Street, a short road between Hershey and Central Street, very close to Main Street. Thomas Fee was active in the local Society of Catholics, which raised the money to build St. Paul's Church. Thomas's brother Michael Fee was one of the soldiers mentioned earlier who died in the Civil War. And here at 51 Hershey Street, Thomas Fee's son, John Henry Fee, supported his family as a shoe and boot dealer, and like his parents, was quite involved with St. Paul's Church, where he was a sexton. When John Henry Fee died at the age of 82, his obituary said he was the oldest living Hingham-born member of St. Paul's congregation. Many members of the Fee family are buried in St. Paul's Cemetery.
John Crowe was born in County Tipperary in 1815. He arrived in Boston on the 7th of December 1847. A month later, he came to Hingham. John worked as a moulder, first making hollowware at the Hingham Malleable Iron Company on the Ware River. When the foundry was destroyed in a fire, John, still a foundryman in the 1880 census, most likely then worked at the Howard Foundry, originally the Eagle Iron Foundry, just a short walk away at Hingham Harbour. John Crowe's wife, Anne Sherry, born in the county of Monaghan in 1828, also arrived in 1847. By 1850, Anne was working for the Whitten family in Hingham as a servant. Anne was an example of the single Irish women with little formal education who emigrated independently and found work cooking and cleaning. They were often referred to at the time as Bridgets or kitchen canaries. In the census records from 1900, there are many such single female Irish women working as live-in domestics in the Summer Street estates of more affluent families, such as the Barnes and Hershey households.
The steep Hershey Street hill ends at South Street. Directly across the rail tracks, Irish immigrants lived up another hill on Thaxter Street. This image, circa 1870, shows the elementary school built on Thaxter Street in 1857. Some of those in the photo likely would have been from Irish immigrant families. There were close ties between families here and those over in Elm and Emerald Street. Several of their Thaxter Street homes stand today. Raymond Keating, who lived with his family at 61 Thaxter Street, was born in 1834 in Tipperary. He worked for decades as an iron molder, likely at the Howard Iron Foundry near the harbour, and later laboured as a stonemason. The home on Thaxter Street dates from the 1860s. Raymond and his wife, Mary McNamara, lived here with their 4 children. When one of their sons, John, died of pneumonia as a young man, one pallbearer was John Walter Pine of Emerald Street. 61 Thaxter Street would stay in the Keating family until the early 1940s. John Daly of 65 Thaxter Street emigrated from County Cork in 1865 with his father, a widower, and 4 siblings. John then married Mary Welch and worked as a stonemason and contractor, likely helping to build other homes in the Irish community of Hingham. 65 Thaxter Street stayed in the Daly family until the 1950s. Patrick Haley and his wife lived at 68 Thaxter Street from 1867 through at least 1885. Patrick worked first as a baker, but later was listed in census records as a labourer. As of the 1880 census, Patrick's daughter Joanna, at age 25, worked at the woolen factory. Bartholomew Quinn Sr. and his wife Ellen arrived with their family in 1854 or 1855. They lived at 69 Thaxter Street. Bartholomew worked as a teamster and a labourer well into his 70s. Daughter Mary Quinn married John Burns on Elm Street. Son Bartholomew Jr. and his family stayed on Thaxter Street. As of 1880, 2 of his daughters, Mary, then 20, and Hannah, then 17, worked in the woolen factory. The Quinn family would live in 69 Thaxter Street until around 1906. In the late 19th and early 20th century, another workplace for Irish immigrants who lived near downtown Hingham and the harbour area was the Thompson Coal Wharf. Michael Joyce and his soon-to-be wife Alice had both arrived from Ireland in 1900 and were married in 1903 at St. Paul's. When Michael registered for the World War I draft, he was a teamster working for Thompson Coal Wharf. He and Alice lived on North Street along what was then called the Cove. As of the 1920 census, the Joyces had 2 teenage children, and Michael had now become a labourer at the Coal Wharf, where Alice did housework for a local family.
Just a short walk from Hingham's most established Irish village on Elm and Emerald Streets is Green Street, which in 1900 included both first and second generation Irish immigrants. The Irish families were primarily from counties of Southern Ireland, like Cork and Tipperary, although Dan Daly, one of the early Irish on Green Street, had arrived in 1855 from County Armagh, in Northern Ireland, where St. Patrick is said to have founded the Celtic Christian monastery. In 1900, many in the neighbourhood, like Dan Daly at 19 Green Street, then 72, and still working to maintain the landscape of a nearby estate, had livelihoods tied to Hingham harbour homes of those of wealth in the Gilded Age. Also working as a gardener in 1900 was 78-year-old John Magner. He and his wife Bridget Hanley were empty nesters in 1900 after raising 5 children at 23 Green Street. One of their sons, John Magner Jr., then lived with his young family on Martin's Lane, where he was a head gardener for the Brewer estate.
Another Green Street resident likely employed by a nearby estate, was Judith Barrett Buttimer, 61, a widow who worked as a laundress. Judith's husband, John Buttimer, a farm labourer, died young at age 55, as did many hard-working immigrant labourers. John had emigrated in 1854 with a younger brother, Thomas Buttimer, who in 1900 was a farm foreman in Hingham. Thomas may have worked at the Jordan Farm, then one of the largest farms in Hingham, located on Union Street, within walking distance of Green Street. The former Jordan Farm property is now the location of Hingham High School. Thomas's son, Thomas H. Buttimer Jr., who became a prominent attorney and was elected state representative, lived over on Lincoln Street. Green Street's location near the harbour gave its residents convenient access to work related to the coal and wood fuel supply dealers, lumber wharfs and other harbour-related businesses. For many, the nearby businesses needed carting and other hauling and loading services which created jobs for Teamsters. Teamsters living on Green Street in 1900 included the recently married Cornelius Ryan, aged 31, and William Welch, aged 33, and married with young children. William Welch was born here to Irish immigrants, John Welch and wife Julia of 6 Green Street. There were several blacksmith shops in the downtown Hingham area then, and one Irish immigrant blacksmith then living on Green Street, Michael Downs, may be one of those shown in this 1900 image of workers in the Huntley blacksmith shop. Another occupation tied to horses at this time was hostler or stableman. One Green Street resident working as a hostler in 1900 was Thomas Morrissey Jr., aged 38, son of immigrants Thomas and Mary Morrissey of 56 Elm Street. Thomas Jr., a former shoemaker, was married to Mary Crean. Early in their married life, they lost 3 young children to scarlet fever. The Morrissey children's young lives are memorialised on the family headstone at St. Paul's Cemetery. The Old Colony Line's South Shore branch through Hingham to Cohasset, built in 1849, created jobs including those held by 40-year-old Irish immigrant Jeremiah Collins. Jeremiah was supporting his Irish-born wife Margaret and 6 children who were born here. He worked as a section foreman for the railroad. Also living on Green Street was a 39-year-old Irish immigrant, Michael Kelly, a track worker for the railroad, whose household included, in addition to his wife, Margaret and 6 children, an Irish-born boarder called Michael Wallace, also a railroad worker. Taking in boarders was a common practice in the Irish community here, both to assist new immigrants and to provide added income for the household. James Dower Jr., 33, in 1900, lived on Green Street with his wife Catherine, their newborn child, and his mother-in-law, Ellen Crean. James was born in Hingham to Irish immigrants James Dower Sr. and Catherine Bowden, who lived over at 135 Hersey Street. In 1900, James Dower Jr. would have walked to work on Hersey Street, where he was a rope maker in his father's rope walk. Mary Casey, living on Green Street in 1900, was the widow of a rope maker, Jonas Casey, who likely also worked at the Dower rope work. The Casey home at 21 Green Street is another vintage highlight of this charming neighbourhood.
In closing, we invite you to think of the Irish immigrant families, their joys, struggles, tragedies and accomplishments as you stroll along any of these Hingham streets.